Okay, so I'm going to continue on this topic of PFAS in non-stick coatings, but I'm going to think more from a life cycle perspective. I'm also going to start with a little bit more introduction, following on from what Lisa presented. Okay. All right, so Lisa mentioned that there's a move ongoing now to have a broad restriction on PFAS in the European Union. And it's going to take a few years to complete this. And it's at the moment very unclear which PFAS will be included. But the information that I have, at least, it's going to be as broad as possible. And what are PFAS? Well, the most recent up-to-date definition, which will be published very soon, is from the OECD, and that's any substance that contains a CF2 or a CF3 fragment in the structure. And that means that that's a lot of substances that contain these very small fragments of either a CF2 or a CF3 fragment in the structure. And Lisa used the OECD list number, which is 4,700 and something. But the US EPA also have a number which is 6,330. But actually these numbers are actually quite an underestimate of the number of substances which have CAS numbers with a CF2 or a CF3 fragment in. And we also know that, that derogations or exemptions will be granted for some of these uses if these uses are considered to be essential. And I'm going to talk more about that as we continue. So I'd at least also mention this, but I'll reiterate it, that PFAS, this is the PFAS universe. And the first differentiation you make in the PFAS universe is which are the polymers and which are the non-polymers. And polymers are high molecular weight substances and non-polymers are low molecular weight substances. So most of the nasty substances that have been identified are low molecular weight substances, things like PFOA, PFOS, and so on. And polymers are quite different substances. Let's see, they're very high molecular weight. And these include the fluoropolymers, things like Ptfe, and they include things like side chain fluorinated polymers, which you have in your Gore-Tex jackets. In some countries, they will have them on the carpets to protect against water and stains. But we're going to talk about fluoropolymers, but it's just important. This is a very important distinction. And it's something that the industry, chemical industry, are very like to point out, because they like to point out that polymers are very, very different, actually regulated completely differently than non-polymers. And the other thing that Lisa pointed out is this diversity of the chemistry of PFAS. You know, we've got, when you just have any substance which just has a CF2 fragment or a CF3 fragment, you can have a lot of other chemistry in the molecule. So you have a huge diversity of different structures that actually belong to the PFAS class. This is just a few examples, and these are all these are just low molecular weight substances. So we have, and this is also something the chemical industry are also pointing out, because they really want to point out this diversity, because they say you cannot lump them all together because they're so different from each other. Not just polymers and non-polymers, but within the low molecular weight, you have neutral, anionic, cationic, solids, liquids, gases. Some are reactive, some are inert, some are soluble, insoluble, some are volatile, some are involatile. Some are mobile, some are immobile. Some bioaccumulate, some do not. Some are toxic and some are really inert. So there's basically the whole range of diversity within the PFAS class. The thing is that, you know, makes everyone concerned about a lot of these things is the high persistence. And I'll explain that a little bit more as in another slide. And also that we don't know much about most of these chemicals in the class. So there's a bit of a fear factor there that we just don't know how these behave. So why are they all of concern? That's the question. You know, they're so different, but are they really of concern? And the only way you can actually group them together is to say that they're all highly persistent. And this is true, actually, that because, as Lisa said, this very strong bond, the carbon-fluorine bond, it means that all PFAS are either persistent themselves or they degrade and ultimately transform into very persistent terminal transformation products. And that is the definition of persistence that the REACH regulation uses. So even if a chemical degrades, if it ultimately transforms into something that's very persistent, it's considered to be a persistent substance. So all PFAS fulfill this property, basically. There's a few exceptions, but almost all of them fulfill this property that they are very persistent. And the problem with very high persistence of this is also things that should not be in the environment, they're synthetic substances, is that if you really continue to release something that's highly persistent, it will accumulate. And that's a problem we have with plastics, which are basically mostly other types of polymers. But the problems we have with plastics is due to their persistence as well. So if you continue to release highly persistent substances into the environment, their levels will increase, and they will accumulate in the environment somewhere. So there will be increasing probabilities of known and unknown effects. And then when you do eventually find a problem, which may take a while, but you will probably eventually find a problem, then you can't do much about it. You cannot reverse the contamination once it's there. So this is a case that persistence in itself is a problem, and we published a paper on about this. Another thing that we have to consider is that we shouldn't only consider the use phase. We also need to consider that during the life cycle of some of these substances, like the fluoropolymers, other substances are released. So we have to consider the whole life cycle. And what are fluoropolymers? Well, we're going to talk mostly about Ptfe today, but there are a whole bunch of other different fluoropolymers, and we use them extremely widely in society. For example, our cell phones have multiple applications of fluoropolymers in them. Our cars have multiple applications of fluoropolymers in them. So they're extremely widely used and quite useful substances in society. And some of them probably have essential uses, like in, for example, essential medical devices that we use that are inserted into our body. But many may not be. But they are very, very widely used. They're actually, in terms of production volumes, they're actually the biggest production volume of all of the PFAS class. And they are used more and more. So you can see in the graph on the bottom here, this was from a paper which was called The Promising Future of Fluoropolymers, which is showing the increase of the use of fluoropolymers in society, and the use, and they're also sort of promoting more applications for the uses of these substances. So this is what's really happening in society. They're useful, and they are going to be used more. And this is from a paper that Lisa also mentioned, where we identified 200 uses of PFAS. I just want to point out that the polymers are used more than the non-polymeric PFAS. And you can see, for example, coatings here is one of the biggest uses of fluoropolymers, but it's not just obviously in cookware, it's in things like cables and many other applications. Building materials. Someone told me that the roof of Globin is coated with a fluoropolymer, for example. So they're very widely used in society, but are they essential? We'll come to that. But first, some definitions. So first of all, fluoropolymer substances, those are the things that I talked about, things like Ptfe, FeP, PVDF. They're the material of a known chemical structure. But then we have the fluoropolymer products, which are the actual products which product manufacturers buy. Which are made by various companies, and these are some of the companies that make fluoropolymers: Chemours, Solvay, Daikin, Asahi Glass, and multiple Chinese companies. And they produce them in different grades. So you have, depending on your application, you can get a different grade of Ptfe. So you can have a granular Ptfe, or you can have a fine powder Ptfe, and they're used for different applications. And they also contain impurities. So they're not just pure substances, these products. They can contain low molecular weight impurities. Things in the past, Ptfe did contain PFOA, and this has been improved over the years. So now it's very, very, very low levels of the processing aids. And it's not PFOA anymore, because PFOA has been phased out by most of these manufacturers. But in China, they're still using PFOA to make Ptfe. So you shouldn't buy your Ptfe from China. Not if it's made by some of these Chinese companies that use APFO. And then we have the fluoropolymers in the finished articles. And this can be, the finished article could be the Ptfe tape, Gore-Tex jacket, or Ptfe cookware. And there are many different processes of making the fluoropolymer products. And some of these grades of the fluoropolymer do not require you to use a PFAS-based processing aid. So during the manufacture of PTFE, the reason PFOA is in there is because you need to use PFOA in certain grades of PTFE, like the fine powder PTFE. You have to use PFOA or the ammonium salt of PFOA to make the material. But in other cases of PTFE, like the granular PTFE, you don't need to. And there's lots of moves underway. I was speaking to the fluoropolymer manufacturers recently, and they are starting to make fluoropolymers now without using any kind of fluorinated processing aid. So for example, some kinds of fluoropolymers can be made, like PVDF, for example, can be made now with a non-fluorinated processing aid. And of course, PFOA, as Lisa mentioned, has been phased out, and there's a wide range of different alternatives. For example, the Genix chemicals that are now used during the manufacture of things like small, fine powder PTFE. So we heard about the EU efforts to phase out the uses of PFAS in society. And we have been thinking about this for some time. And we realized that because PFAS are actually used so widely in society, it's impractical to phase out all of their uses in one step, because some uses probably do have an essential function in society, whereas other uses may be non-essential. They may just be there because of market opportunity. They may not have a function in the product. And then there are other uses which can be substitutable. There are alternatives which are better for the safer. So you can substitute the PFAS in those particular uses. And this idea of essentiality came from originally from the Montreal Protocol for phasing out ozone depleting substances that started in about the 1970s. And we published a paper about this concept, the essential use concept, in 2019. So you basically have to just assess all of the uses and decide whether they fall into these three categories: essential, non-essential, or substitutable. And we made some criteria for doing this, determining whether your use is non-essential, whether it's essential for health, society, and the functioning, health and safety and the functioning of society, or whether the use can be regarded as essential for society, but there are alternatives which can do the function, so you can substitute them. And there are some uses which are essential, and that there are no alternatives, so you have to continue using them. But at the same time, essentiality is only temporary, because innovation may come up with a product, and this should be encouraged, where you're using chemicals of concern in an essential function. You should encourage innovation to replace these substances with safer alternatives as you go forward. So is the use of PTFE in non-stick coatings an essential use? Well, it's not really. It's not essential for health, safety, and the functioning of society, but it is very convenient. I mean, we all know that we don't like things to stick to our pan when we're like frying our eggs and so on. So it's extremely convenient function. But chemicals of concern should not be used to provide just convenient technical functions according to the strict definition of essential use. And then the next question, is PTFE a chemical of concern? If it's lumped together with all of PFAS and based on its high persistence, yes, it would fall as a chemical of concern. But there's a lot of efforts from industry to say no, it's not a chemical of concern. And so there are papers being published by industry saying, no, it should be considered differently, and it's not a chemical of concern. Are there alternatives to PTFE? Well, the non-stick functionality can be provided by some of these alternatives. So there are iron ceramic, anodized aluminum coatings, for example. Some of these may not be PFAS free, so you have to be careful when you look at some of these alternatives. You also have to consider, do they provide sufficient technical performance when you do an alternative assessment? And also, do they really have a lower environmental impact than PTFE? You can't just assume they do because they're PFAS free. You have to consider also the life cycle impacts of some of these alternatives. So what about PTFE and non-stick cookware? Is it toxic? Is it a risk? Lisa talked a little bit about this. There are some impurities, but industry have, over the years, reduced these impurities a lot. So they're a lot lower than they used to be. They removed the processing aids. We did hear that they can generate PFCAs above the gas phase at very high temperatures. But we should also remember that we have PFOA in our food and other PFCAs from the environmental contamination. So we can't reduce the exposure in our food. We're going to be exposed to low levels of PFOA and other PFCAs because it's in our food anyway from the environmental exposure. And the tiny amounts that get in, maybe from the pan or from heating the pan too much, is much, it's much lower than that's in the food already. Although we need to really consider this carefully. And again, is Ptfe a polymer of low concern? Well, this is what the industry are saying, and they've published this paper. They say, look, it's inert. It doesn't contain any impurities. It's not toxic. It shouldn't be lumped together with the other PFAS. So this is a big push they're making, but they only consider the use phase in this paper. And this really annoyed us, that they just totally ignored the manufacturing and the waste disposal. So we published a paper where we wanted to consider the whole life cycle of PFAS and consider the emissions during the whole life cycle. And one of the big problems with manufacturing fluoropolymers is historically, there was a huge problem in that the ammonium salt of PFOA was used in the manufacture, at least of the fine powder Ptfe. And as a result of that, we have PFOA everywhere in the environment, wildlife and humans as a result of this historical manufacturing of fluoropolymers. And it's still, till this day, used as the processing aid by many companies in China. But we also heard that manufacturers in the US, Europe and China and Japan have phased out the use of APFO, and are now using fluorinated alternatives like the ones here, which are also PFAS. And now we're starting to see problems with these. So this is just from a paper that we published in 2005 or 2006, showing that fluoropolymer manufacturing was the biggest source of PFOA and other PFCAs to the environment historically. So 80% of the PFOA in the global environment is from fluoropolymer manufacturing. And now we see new problems with all of these alternative processing aids. So like the HFPO dimer acid, which is sometimes called Genex on the top left, we're starting to see contamination of all of these alternative processing aids around the plant, and people getting very, very upset about their drinking water being contaminated and worried about the risks from these alternatives. And you're seeing it in the news more and more. If you look in the media, you can see these papers that are coming out. Dordrecht in the Netherlands is one of the areas in Europe where they're using the Genex chemicals, and there's exposure all around there. There's also in North Carolina a big problem. In China, there's massive problems with the continuing use of APFO. And the whole problem with fluoropolymer manufacturing has been picked up in movies that have come out as well. So you can watch these movies to find out more information about all of the contamination around some of these fluoropolymer manufacturing sites. So releases during manufacturing, we have the polymerization processing aids like PFOA, Genex, but we also have volatile fluorinated byproducts, which have global warming potential. We have oligomers that are found in the stack, which are just basically small parts of polymers, which are released. And we have multiple unknown PFAS. So for example, Chemours themselves, it used to be called DuPont, have found 250 unknown PFAS around one of their plants in North Carolina. And the US EPA published a paper last year in Science showing there was some unknown PFAS in the soils all the way around the one of the fluoropolymer manufacturing plants in the US. So there's a huge issue with the manufacturing, and the industry are well aware of this. What about the disposal of fluoropolymers? Well, what at end of life? Can we recycle Ptfe? Well, it's not really an industrialized thing. It doesn't happen. So what happens to Ptfe coated cookware at the end of life? What would I do with my Ptfe pan? I'd probably take it to the metal recycling and throw it in there. And I think most people would. Or you could maybe take it to a retailer and say, can you take care of it? Some retailers offer this. I don't know what they do with it. but you know, they may have better ways of recycling it. We have this release of the small plastic materials from the pans as well. As Lisa said, we think it's inert, but we don't know actually about very small plastics, whether nanoplastics are able to penetrate cell membranes. Ptfe particles have been found in Mediterranean fish, and they've been found in Arctic sediments. So they are definitely being distributed in the environment. What about incinerating Ptfe? Well, it requires very high temperatures to destroy the carbon-fluorine bond. There could be formation of fluorinated organic byproducts during incineration. This is something that we don't really know. But it's an area of active research right now to try and find out what happens to all of these products that contain PFAS, you know, when they're incinerated. We suspect that, that there are PFAS generated during incineration, particularly if it's not at a particular high enough temperature. I was sent this information by Runex through Twitter, which is a kind of an umbrella organization for the baking industry in Sweden. And they told me that the commercial bakeries, because, you know, we use PTFE in our homes, but commercial bakeries use PTFE coated trays, for example, when they bake, you know, when they bake bread in large volumes. At the end of life, every now and again, between 12 and 24 months, the PTFE has to be recoated on these pans. So in Sweden alone, every year there's 20,000 baking pans that are recoated with a total baking surface of about 500,000 meters squared. And the old coating is stripped off. Basically, it's burnt off at not very high temperature to get rid of the coating, or it's just blasted off water, and it's basically just released to the environment. So that a lot of PTFE gets, you know, emitted to the environment as a result of this, you know, end of life of the, well, not end of life of the pan, but end of life of the PTFE on the pan. So there's unknown emissions of the PTFE into the environment. Finally, can PTFE be made without fluorinated processing aids? That would solve one of the big problems with PTFE. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some companies that are making, for example, fine powder PVDF, which is another kind of fluoropolymer, without fluorinated processing aids. And they say that PTFE can also be made without fluorinated processing aids. It's just a case of time. It took them 20 years of R&D. And I know that I spoke to Chemours the other day, and they are also doing an R&D to replace fluorinated processing aids, but they say it will take time. But it's the next step after Gen-X, they say. So there are patents available for making PTFE without fluorinated processing aids, but they haven't been operationalized in most cases. But it's certainly possible, and it probably will happen within the next few years. So the conclusions and the way forward. So PTFE does not provide an essential function, and there are alternatives if convenience is desired. Is PTFE a polymer of low concern? Well, it's inert in the use phase, and this is what the industry are pointing out in their papers, but they neglect all of the environmental releases of PFAS that occur during the life cycle of the PTFE. So there's release of PFAS during manufacture and waste disposal. And manufacturing remains a huge problem. You know, there's so much attention to this. The people who live around this are, you know, sometimes really angry about all of the contamination that they receive from the manufacturing. We don't really know about the problems with release of PTFE particles because the research on very small particles is in its infancy. We don't actually know so much about the alternatives either to PTFE in cookware. Are they definitely safe? I don't know. There's certainly some research needs to be done on that before we can, you know, we shouldn't just say shift to products which are PFAS free without doing some kind of assessment. And, you know, if we don't manage to phase out PTFE from cookware, then the manufacturers are certainly trying to improve the way they manufacture PTFE and their waste management. There's lots, they are, you know, really concerned about obviously losing business. So they are making huge efforts now to reduce the emissions during manufacturing and waste management. But, you know, maybe they're too late, but they're definitely trying their best to to sort of reduce the emissions. So thank you for your attention. I realized I had to speed up quite a bit there because I had quite a lot of information to share.